Welcome to this session. We're going to turn our attention now to welfare systems, to those systems of social security, social insurance and social protection, which are a very central part of public policy. These are often very costly, often one of the largest items of public expenditure for countries, and they directly affect the incomes and living standards of millions of people. Indeed, of all of us across our life course, from the cradle to the grave, to coin a phrase. So a very important part of the social policy domain, and a very important issue for the future, because the challenges to these systems of social security are many and diverse. Challenges of an ageing population, challenges of changes to the labour market, making employment less secure for many people, challenges because of changes in family structures. Did I mention ageing population? If I didn't, I'll say it again. But perhaps more importantly, challenges, I think, to the legitimacy and justification for these sorts of systems and the way they operate in society. So I think we've got some major issues to address during this session. We've got three fantastic speakers for the panel. They're not quite the panel that was in your programme, you may have noticed, because sadly we lost two of our speakers at rather short notice for various reasons. They couldn't. Louise Haag and Robert Joyce couldn't join us today. But I'm delighted that two of my colleagues from the university have been able to step up into their shoes. So let me introduce very briefly our three speakers, because I don't want to take their time. It's them you want to hear from. So we've got Fran Bennett from the University of Oxford, where she's a senior research and teaching fellow and an expert in social security policy, particularly around areas of gender, income distribution, poverty and social protection. Next to her we've got Luke Martinelli from the Institute for Policy Research here at the University of Bath, where he is an expert working on basic income, on this idea of introduction of a universal basic income and what that could replace or change for our systems of social security. And finally, we've got Rana Jawad from the Department of Social Policy Sciences, and she is an expert in social protection in low and middle income countries, particularly the Middle East and North Africa. So we've got an array of talent here on the stage who are going to, I've asked them each to talk for just 10 minutes. They're going to have got a lot to cover, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion. And I'm going to ask Fran to please kick us off.
Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you very much for the invitation to this varied and challenging day. We've been asked to speak on the basis of our own research. Mine focuses in particular on the UK, within Europe, still, as we speak, I think. It focuses on social security within welfare systems more generally. And note that the phrase used in the programme was not welfare states, it was welfare systems, partly perhaps because we need to look at private provision, for example, and tax reliefs and tax allowances, for example, as well as the state provision of social security. So it's a wider idea, I think. I also focus in my work on those under pension age in particular, not just working age, because it's children as well. We often talk about working age benefits, but they are also usually for children as well. And I focus on gender, by which I mean not biological differences, but structural and relational issues. Currently, I'm researching couples living on universal credit with Jane and Rita Griffiths and other colleagues here at the University of Bath. And my previous research has largely, to be honest, been policy analysis, really, rather than either quantitative or qualitative research. And I've particularly done work on universal credit, which we may want to look at in the questions. But I've also looked in terms of qualitative research at the allocation and distribution of resources within the household. And particularly with Sirin Sung, who's now at Belfast, we looked at low to moderate income couples on means-tested benefits and tax credits, where we found, despite the fact that a lot of them said their money was all in one pot, that was the kind of phrase they used, money in your own right did have some meaning, particularly for women. And in some couples, it seemed to us as if women had that, it seemed to make either for more equal relationships within the couple or give some freedom of manoeuvre to women in more unequal couples. So my first thought about today's task was that several of the key challenges identified for this session have clear gender dimensions. So gender, I think, is important to the issues identified. If we're thinking about implications for welfare systems more generally than just social security. And what I mean by that is, for example, we might think that free provisions such as childcare was a better solution for a particular kind of problem than, for example, having marketised provision of childcare and then means testing people on low incomes to help them with the cost of such marketised childcare. So social provision can be broader and sometimes a better solution than social security. So I wouldn't want to say that social security is the solution in every particular case. So the kinds of challenges that I think have gender implications that have been identified for this session, one is obviously the fluidity of family forms. And I think we shouldn't muddle that up with everybody just becoming an isolated individual without any family connections. That is clearly not what is happening in today's society. Ageing societies, which Jane mentions, which includes not just older people increasing in number and proportion, and the old, but also, of course, fertility issues within some countries, and both of those causing perhaps caring deficits, which have been identified as a social policy issue in many countries, and also insecurities in the labour market. And obviously there are other issues with gender dimensions. And whilst these may vary between countries, it increasingly seems to me that it makes less sense to divide them into the global north versus the global south, or indeed developed versus developing countries, as Martin was talking about them this morning. And I think it's the same with solutions, which are increasingly shared, at least in terms of debates, across countries, despite the different welfare traditions within different countries. So, for example, UNICEF recently held an international conference on universal child grants. But what about what goes on within households in terms of something with gender implications, and the area I've researched as a key challenge? Well, globally, particularly in international development circles and in the international financial institutions, the empowerment of women has been taken as important. And it's often been equated with the direct receipt of money. And therefore, for example, conditional cash transfers, first in Latin America originally and then spreading elsewhere, but even being considered within Europe in relation to the early years, have been seen as one of the instruments by which you might empower women. As I said in my work, it is certainly true that the receipt of income can give some advantages, in particular in gender unequal situations. But as in Latin America, the main purpose of those transfers may be different. It may be that it confirms the gender role division within families, particularly if those transfers are conditional on behaviours, as they are with conditional cash transfers, and they can add to the burden of household work and the stereotypical view of women as having, as Hilary Land and Rose said, compulsory altruism. You could argue that it's the conditions rather than the payments that are the problem there, of course, but I think it does give us pause rather than thinking that this is an automatic solution. And also it means that, as Zelitzer said, money has different connotations depending on its source, the recipient, the labelling, and the use to which it is put. And that may have implications for gender roles and relationships and not just somebody's well-being. And that kind of thinking led me, in collaboration with Janet Veitch, when we were doing what I think was the first gender analysis of universal credit, or at least the plans for universal credit, for Oxfam in 2010, to draw up some principles for gender analysis of social security reforms, or welfare reform, as it's often called. These were adapted, I should say, from Mary Daly and Catherine Rake's book in 2003. So in our view, gender analysis must go beyond comparing the numbers of women and men who get transfer of resources between them because of the change. It must go beyond the amount of resources transferred to examine the nature and labelling of any such resources which are transferred and the impact on gender roles and relationships that I've just been talking about. And it must consider the impact of welfare reforms on the financial security and autonomy of women and men, on their caring responsibilities if relevant, and on inequalities within and outside the household, both at the point of change and in the longer term over the life course. And we know that tax and benefit systems can affect inequalities within the household as well as between households, and that may affect work incentives, which of course may affect future incomes as well as current incomes. This set of suggestions, which was actually cited by the government, although I have to say not used, means that the analysis of social security changes must, insofar as possible, go inside the household as well and not just look at the household. But I would also argue that financial autonomy is not the same as individualisation, and that when we're talking about financial autonomy, which feminists have always recognised is in the context of interdependence, financial autonomy, if it's truly to be realised, can only be realised in the context of strong social support systems, which are also sustainable, I should say. The issue I wanted to discuss briefly as an example of why gender analysis is important is in-work poverty, which is something I've written about before. Now, you could argue that this is a question of framing, because only certain solutions are considered if you frame a problem in certain ways. Those social policy students here will be very familiar with that argument. So if you talk about in-work poverty, it puts emphasis on the person who is in work in that particular unit, and therefore it puts emphasis on the worker, and therefore it puts emphasis on either improving the wage of that person or improving in-work benefits as the solution to in-work poverty. Now, of course, that may be contributory factors to in-work poverty, but in fact, as the IFS and others have recognised, there is a whole range of other issues which may be implicated. But the main solution on offer at the moment, I think, in relation to in-work poverty, it would be fair to say, is the living wage, which has even been adopted by the government as the national living wage for those aged 25 plus, forcing the Living Wage Foundation to call the voluntary living wage the real living wage. And it's been argued, and I think rightly at the moment really, that the real living wage is the only game in town for low-paid people. And of course, improvement in wage rates for low-paid people is good news. But the analysis, it seems to me, points us in the wrong direction because it confuses low pay on the one hand, hourly gross pay rates, with in-work poverty on the other, which is a much more complex solution. And recently, in fact, it's interesting that the Living Wage Foundation has actually launched the Living Hours campaign, which perhaps is an acknowledgement that hours of work and not just the hourly pay rate may be part of the problem. But I think a gender analysis would, in addition, ask why, for example, certain kinds of work are undervalued, paid work are undervalued in relation to others, the causes of low hours of work by some people, particularly if those are due to caring, and particularly in one-earner couples, which the IFS has recognised, particularly for couples with children, is a big, has a correlation with in-work poverty, why there is one partner who is out of the labour market with no income of their own. So, for example, those traditional social protection benefits, for example, for those who have health conditions at home, may have been reduced in value, as they have, may have been reduced in length, as they have, may have been made more difficult to qualify for, as they have, and we should be looking at that and, for example, at the gap between the end of well-paid parental leave and the beginning of free childcare in the UK, which is one of the longest in comparable countries, as contributory factors to in-work poverty, particularly for those people who are living in couples. There are additional issues there, including housing costs and cuts in support for children. Now, I'm aware that some people would argue that in-work poverty is tackled successfully by universal credit. And I'm aware that some people argue that it could be tackled more successfully by universal basic income, but those are issues I'll lead to the later parts of the discussion. So in conclusion, I just wanted to emphasise that women are often in a disadvantaged position in relation to social security, in particular because of their relative position in the labour market and their caring responsibilities, both of which, of course, are related. And we need to tackle those things directly and not just via social security. But also that because of those issues, social security benefits are often more important source of income to women than they are to men, either in terms of their own position or in terms of them acting as a conduit to give benefits to other people, particularly children. And so social security is certainly crucial to gender equality. I think there are complex issues around this. in particular tensions about how we protect those who have suffered from the gender division of labour without cementing that gender division of labour further, and how we promote an analysis which actually explores the texture of gendered lives and also encourages a perspective that goes beyond a snapshot of the household at one point in time to explore individuals' trajectories over the life course as a basis for a better social security system in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fran. You've given us a lot to think about already, but I'm going to turn to our next speaker straight away, Rana, to take us off. Yes, I think you can just speak.
Oh, right, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. So I'll just start off in a similar vein to Fran and just tell you a little bit about the kind of research that I've been doing. For a long time now, since the PhD days, I've had an interest in the welfare systems of the Middle East and North Africa region at a time where the two concepts really were kind of poles apart. And this came from the interest in understanding how policy systems worked. So the question wasn't just about social welfare or well-being or social justice, but trying to understand as well processes for claiming those rights and for accessing those services. And in a sense, really, I think what I would say sort of in this 10 minutes and in relation to the wider interest in social protection that I'll refer to is that there are these two important distinctions when we talk about welfare systems, in that on the one hand, yes, there is the emphasis on delivery systems, delivering services and perhaps targeting vulnerable groups or particular populations. But then on the other hand, there is a very important political question about how we are able to access those services in the first place, whether there needs to be some kind of social transformation that happens, an expansion of rights, which is a fundamentally political question. And I think that these are two very important parameters that low and middle income countries have to face, if we're going to talk about the future of welfare systems or the future of social protection. So it's not simply a matter of delivering systems, but it's also about the political mobilization, principles of entitlement, political settlements that underpin who gets what and how and why. And those are very fundamental questions which can never go away and really show why the question of welfare systems is so interdisciplinary and so broad. So I'll briefly reflect on the social protection paradigm, if I may, because that you'll be familiar with it, but from the perspective of low and middle income countries, this really matters, and certainly from the MENA region, in many ways, the policy agenda is set by donor agencies, as we might find in other parts of the world. So a statement like this and a visionary statement of this sort, that countries need to have universal social protection systems, is something that needs to be translated into national development plans, which is what MENA region would be doing at the moment, as other parts in the world do. So I think it's worth thinking about this question of social protection. And some of the work I've been doing recently is focusing on that discourse at a policy level and looking at the interactions between international donors and reports using case studies from the MENA region. And it's fair to say that, and perhaps maybe this is how all policy discourses are, vagueness is the friend of politicians, perhaps, if I may put it that way. So for me, I think there are three potential avenues for the social protection discourse. And on the ground, social protection is clearly affecting welfare systems and the conceptualization of social policies in low and middle income countries. This is not to say that they never had these systems, and that's why this distinction between systems of delivery and political emancipation matters, And in this sense, the Middle East, as other LMIC countries or even Western Europe, have used welfare provision as a form of political appeasement. And this has existed everywhere. So this question is important. With the social protection paradigm, it's fair to say that there are some dominant actors. So the World Bank in particular, the IMF, sort of the inheritors of the Washington Consensus, are promoting what could be called a risk mitigation approach, which is very much about targeting cash transfers to vulnerable groups, Hence, in a sense, for a lot of LMIC countries, social protection is welcome and it fits with the existing paradigm. And in the Middle East, you know, from Saudi Arabia all the way to Morocco, they welcome social protection because it can be integrated into an already existing residual system of social welfare. And then there are other avenues which, in fairness, are perhaps advocated for more by academics, a lot of them in the UK, some of them acting as consultants for some of these large donor agencies, and these are beginning to highlight the gaps in the social protection discourse, that we cannot reach universalism without having some adequate understanding of how political settlements are achieved, and in fact, universalism is meaningless if we don't understand how local institutions operate. And hence there is a focus on political settlements and thinking about how social policy provides an agenda for institutionalizing welfare within existing systems. So in that sense, I think there is a lot of vagueness and there is room for maneuver with the social protection discourse, and it's being translated in many different ways across regions. Added to that is the question of finance. So a lot of LMIC countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, might be developing social protection programs, but the financing and the funding of this is heavily dependent on some donor agencies, as we might know, so the sustainability of these programs is something as well to consider for the future. And in that sense, I think the question of universalism, from some perspectives, it's more a matter of mixing, and it's a combination of employment-based social insurance and social assistance, but then we hit upon the reality of a large informal sector, in terms of employment. In the MENA region, the estimates are up to around 50% of the population, if not higher, being in the informal sector. So then again, we hit that question, which is clearly on the minds of a lot of analysts looking at these issues. The question of inequality, I think, is paramount here. And what this is a general configuration. Some of you will be already familiar with this. But from my perspective, I think that this is clearly a sensitive question, but for a lot of LMIC countries, if there is going to be any kind of universal provision, there has to be some attention paid to questions of inequality and the question of political settlements, rather than the risk mitigation approach or the social cash transfers, which are facing difficulties in terms of scalability and in terms of graduation, and there are issues of welfare dependency. Having said this, more recently, again, these estimates vary and it's not possible to homogenize, but there are increasing arguments that inequality in the MENA region is potentially the highest, and certainly the World Bank, when they were trying to explain the Arab uprisings, began to refer to the inequality puzzle, and so for the first time began to address this question of the quality of life in the region, because it was on track for a lot of the Millennium Development Indicators. And in a sense, this region really is a laggard, so in the 1990s, governments began to acknowledge the existence of poverty, and now they're having to think about social protection and where it fits into their existing programs. There is still a lot of emphasis on social assistance and social work, and there is a lot of effort going into the reform of social work provision and how to access and support vulnerable groups. There is also a very important priority of dealing with budget deficits. So in fact, a lot of the MENA countries, and particularly I should clarify, Arab countries within the southern Mediterranean region, are actually undergoing some really major austerity policies and welfare reform processes. And clearly sort of, again, leaving an important question in terms of how they will fulfill that original vision. And if we're thinking about the future, and I'll probably end with this, it's good to have a sense of how our institutions change. So I've done a bit of that historical institutionalist approach. And certainly there is an argument I present for the social protection discourse, which is that, how far have the institutions underpinning these discourses changed? And comparatively, so this is probably a very rare data set, comparing social spending across all regions, and it includes the Middle East here, and the emphasis being on the social assistance and social insurance bars, so the red and blue bars. This is internal data for the World Bank. This is the best they could come up with in terms of homogenized comparative data on spending. And if we're going back to the historical institutional approach, I was quite struck when I first saw this, that in fact, the MENA region appears to have been historically, for as long as we have data, the highest spender on social assistance. And this is an interesting one because in the Latin American literature, there is a celebration of the fact that there is an increase in non-contributory social assistance, and that this could be sort of the new shape of a future welfare state, as it were. And I think one of the important questions I ask, which goes back to this distinction between systems of welfare delivery and political mobilization around social protection, is, well, this is a region that's historically spent a lot on social assistance and continues to do so, whether that's in cash or in kind. And so I think it's important to ask that question, and the politicization of welfare is an important one to consider. So really, political will, we talk a lot about political will. The political will is there to deliver services, but I think the question is how far the delivery of these services and the groups that benefit from them, what the primary objectives of those are. I think the closer we can link these welfare systems to questions of equality or freedom or democracy, I think that the closer we would be to the original vision that's set out in the SDG 2030 agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Again, a very wide-ranging and perceptive analysis. Let's move on to our third speaker, Luke, who's going to focus on the universal basic income.
Thanks, Jane. Yes, so I'm going to focus on universal basic income, which for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, is the concept of an unconditional, uniform payment made to everyone within a political community. And I think it's very apt for this particular panel because for a long time now, basic income has been positioned as the future of welfare by increasing numbers of people and increasingly mainstream political actors and commentators as well. And that claim is made particularly in relation to expectations about technologically induced labour market change, so that the spectre of technological unemployment and the possibility of a post-work future. But it's also been made in relation to a number of broader challenges as well. So I'm going to talk about, just very briefly, whether basic income does or should have a role in welfare systems in the future. So I'm going to quickly go over a couple of the main sort of arguments in relation to three areas, in relation to technological change, which I've also already mentioned, some issues around changing family structures and an apparent crisis of care, which Fran alluded to as well. And finally, just a brief word about some ecological benefits of basic income potentially, all of which are sort of these major challenges facing welfare systems that basic income supporters argue and claim it could solve. But I'm also going to talk about concrete issues of political feasibility, which is where my research has been focused on at the IPR. So going beyond the normative arguments for what a basic income could do in the abstract and thinking about the possibilities for implementation, the possibilities for coalitions of support to actually coalesce around a basic income. So very briefly, I said, it's been positioned by increasing numbers. There's been a massive amount of media attention, which won't have escaped your notice. In a few years, there's been a Swiss referendum on the possibility of a basic income. There's been numerous trials and pilots already taking place. In developing countries, in India and Namibia originally, and more recently in Finland, so in an advanced welfare state. There have also been talks and moves towards trials in Canada, the Netherlands, and even in Scotland, where a feasibility study has been funded, although where exactly that will go is another question. In the UK, Labour Party launched a consultation on it with a possible commitment to run trials at the UK level as well. And just to illustrate the diversity of the range of countries in which basic income is an important issue, the Indian Congress Party recently had a commitment to a form of basic income. One of the presidential candidates in the US has also run on a platform of basic income. So it's quite a diverse sort of set of motivations around it. There were also suggestions that around half of European voters favour basic income, although I would caveat that that's in the abstract, and that possibly support might fall when taking into account concrete issues of affordability and so on. So anyway, this has been motivated, in my view, by a general sense that existing welfare systems are in crisis. And there are numerous sort of main areas that applies to. So first one is gaps in coverage, whether it be because of failure of social insurance mechanisms, punitive conditionality and sanctions, and particularly in countries like the UK. The notion that conditions are, in any case, intrusive and stigmatising, they're very bureaucratic, and existing welfare systems discourage work through the withdrawal of the benefits, reducing the financial incentives to actually find work and increase income. So all of these are sort of generic issues that basic income, in principle, addresses. But a few of the main challenges that I want to talk about in more detail are technological change, family structures, and ecological benefits. So just about technological change, which is probably the most sort of common major issue that's discussed recently in the context of basic income. There's been a very sort of apocalyptic claim that we're facing a post-work future. And even if you don't agree with that or believe that that's a very distant prospect indeed, we're already seeing some of the significant disruption to the labour market in other ways. So basic income might help with these issues as well. One of them is because automation is generally replacing low-skilled and routine work, that leads to unemployment within those segments of the labour market and in particular wage polarisation. So this is linked to the growth of in-work poverty and low wages that Fran mentioned as well. But technological change has more sort of general macro effects as well, and technological change has been linked to the rise in superstar firms and rising inequality more generally. So alongside globalisation, which in itself is technologically induced, the argument is basically that large corporations have increased their leverage vis-à-vis capital, and that this is reducing the bargaining power of the latter, leading to poorer working pay and conditions. And so this is leading then to the emergence of the precariat, which is again discussed in the context of basic income most commonly. That's workers without fixed term, on impermanent or patchy employment contracts, otherwise known as Uberisation. And more generally, economic changes have led to the decline in blue-collar manufacturing insider jobs, and that's further cemented the gaps in social insurance coverage. So as well as basic income providing a sort of basic floor to cover all of these issues, it also complements the knowledge-intensive digital economy by supporting, for example, lifelong learning, encouraging entrepreneurship and self-employment, and generally aiding with frequent employment transitions that are increasingly important in the knowledge economy. The second area that basic income is argued to sort of policy problem that's to solve is this issue of a crisis in care. And I think it's well described here that when a society simultaneously withdraws public support for social reproduction and conscripts the chief providers of it into long and grueling hours of paid work, it depletes the very social capacities on which it depends. That's a quote from Nancy Fraser. And basic income, it's argued, by proponents, I should add, recognises the value of that unpaid care work. But at the same time, it sort of has a dual effect of helping working parents with childcare costs. It can encourage sharing of caring responsibilities between partners. And it also does things like potentially facilitate early retirement or reductions in working hours, which again help with that unpaid care sector. And more generally, basic income, in giving an independent income to everyone, reduces intra-household inequalities that arise from a sort of male breadwinner model. So all of those ways sort of complement gender equality, arguably. And the final one, which I'll just mention very briefly, is the ecological benefits. So it's also been posited as a way to help transition to a post-productivist economy by decoupling income from production per se, decommodifying labour. It reduces financial incentives and encourages a sort of gradual path towards degrowth. So for all those reasons, basic incomes has sort of strong credentials to argue that it has some place in the future of welfare systems. But I think the reality is a bit less rosy when we consider some of the issues I'm about to, which relate to trade-offs in policy design and generally political barriers to implementation. So moving from the abstract sort of idea of basic income was actually a large family of proposals which varies along payment level, the way it interacts with existing welfare systems, and the funding mechanism. So actually, when you start to look at specific concrete schemes, the apparently broad support for basic income actually starts to break down. The individual advantages that are apparent in the abstract are arguably very difficult to achieve in a single scheme. So if you start to specify concrete design features, for example, right-wing proponents of basic income wouldn't agree with a large, generous basic income paid alongside a large, generous welfare state. They want a basic income that slashes the welfare state. So immediately you see this sort of apparent agreement dissolving. More generally than that, when you start to design specific schemes, and this is one of the things that I've looked at in my work, there are intractable trade-offs between affordability and the adequacy of a basic income to achieve what it's supposed to. So full basic income schemes, which would be preferred by conservative or libertarian advocates, are generally either very expensive or they actually don't do what a basic income is supposed to. They make large numbers of poor people worse off because you're replacing an existing modulated system with a uniform payment. The partial schemes, which leave the existing system in place, are better in that respect, but they still cost a great deal. They still involve significant tax rises. And they sort of beg the question, what's the point? If you're not using this as a replacement for the welfare system, why not just reform the existing system anyway? So they lose support from people who support basic income as a replacement for the welfare state, and they actually lose some of the effectiveness in tackling some of the issues they're supposed to. And IPR polling sort of confirmed this when we looked at different mechanisms for support. So when you ask people, do they support basic income, around half agree. And when you specify that that would be paid for either through tax rises or reductions in existing spending, the level of support falls quite considerably. And also, the preferred option depends on your political stance in the first place. So you've definitely got a sort of breakdown in the apparent coalition of support behind it. Yeah, I mean, just on that, so I think that the right-wing version is inadequate. It's unfavourable from many perspectives. So let's think about the sort of left-wing version, a basic income which props up an existing expansive welfare state, which personally I would sort of favour. But then you've got a political problem that the progressive left itself is very, very divided on basic income. A lot of the left view basic income as a capitulation to neoliberalism. They favour contributory benefits. A lot of trades unions and labour movements are very invested in earnings-related contributory benefits and don't wish to lose the privileged access to those. Other people on the left prefer targeting because it's more effective at reducing poverty for the given cost. And in general, the support of labour market insiders is actually fairly low. I think that's kind of everything I was going to go through in terms of the barriers and trade-offs. So in conclusion, the most sensible option in terms of tackling these issues is a partial basic income, one that provides an unconditional floor but retains contributory systems, retains targeted benefits, retains capacitating social services like childcare and so on. But it's very expensive, it still faces considerable political barriers. And the question really arises that, desirable though it may be, is it a sensible strategic focus? Or does it just draw support from more immediately feasible welfare reforms, such as implementation of universal childcare, reform of sanctions and punitive conditionality, and a generalised sort of increase in the generosity and coverage of existing benefits?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Luke. That was a really great introduction to both the sort of politics and the technicalities of basic income. So we've got about 10 minutes, a bit longer now, for some questions, comment, discussion. We might get the panel to fight each other if they decide to do so, but kind of throw it open. And Mike will come to you, and if you could say who you are, that would be great. Who would like to kick us off with a question? Comment? Yes, down at the front.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed all of those presentations. I wanted to ask a question to each panellists. Where can we be optimistic about the future of the welfare state? There has been a lot of talk about, because of austerity, because of lots of things you've described, and looking around places like the UK, much of the data that Rana showed about inequality and patchy coverage in many other countries around the world. Are there reasons that we can be optimistic that there are other drivers of expansion of welfare states, whether it's ageing, whether it's certain kinds of social need, whether there are certain social or political coalitions that might underpin a more optimistic future for a welfare state, given that over the course of the 20th century, by and large, welfare states grew?
Okay, reasons to be cheerful. Who wants to start us off? Fran.
Reasons to be cheerful, 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I think is really important is, particularly where social security is concerned, is not to rubbish the whole system, which I think a lot of people do. I mean, Tony Blair comes to mind, for example, sort of saying social security is a kind of sign of economic failure. No, it isn't a sign of economic failure. It is crucial to economic success, but it is not just oiling the wheels of the economy. It's clearly important, and it was shown to be important actually during the financial crisis as an automatic stabiliser. And that's exactly what was done under Labour to begin with. And it provides absolutely critical help to lots of people still now, despite all the cuts and all the changes that have been made. I'm talking about the UK, but of course that's also true worldwide. So I think it's really important to recognise the valuable range of functions that social security in particular provides and continues to provide. Not just automatic stabiliser, not just social investment functions, but also all sorts of other functions. And it's not just the relief of poverty, but also the prevention of poverty, the help with additional costs. So, for example, we share the costs of children, we share the costs of disability. It provides help in retirement, it provides help in other situations, and so on. So I think that's the first thing, is to say I don't think social security is failing. Right, so I'm talking about social security rather than the welfare state. So that's the first thing. I think there are pressures for additional costs. My own view would be that there are actually pressures for, you could argue, pressures for contributory benefits. And the two I would pick out there are, one is social care. I mean, not contributory benefits, but contributions towards social provision. One is social care, where I think the argument for a social insurance system for social care is gaining ground, as opposed to a means-tested system with a cap and all those kinds of things. That's one area. And the other area, I think, is still actually more improvements in parental provision. And that's a classic insurance sharing risk scenario where you've actually got parental leave paid for. I suspect the provision for fathers in particular will improve in the UK in future years. So I think there are drivers, not just social need, but also in those kinds of examples, actually big groups of the population who would have an interest in both those areas, for example, just like they had in the improved new basic pension, new state pension. And in those kinds of situations, it's more likely that social security provision improves. the last point I'd make is one thing I didn't say and meant to is I think how you persuade people to pay for a more generous social security system is actually a more important question than any of the issues about what the structure of the system ought to be like. I think that's the crucial system we ought to debate more than we actually do.
Thank you. Luke?
I am not particularly optimistic, so I'm not quite sure how to go about it. But just thinking about it there, I think there might be a particular sort of window of opportunity where the welfare state complements, so sort of in contrast to what you just said, complements social investment related sort of activations functions. So where there's a sort of clear, labour market stroke efficiency gain in doing so, there might be more of a case and an easier case politically to make for expansion of the welfare system. So that would mean expanding the care, maybe to a more universal childcare system, for example, because there are tangible benefits in relation to facilitating transitions into employment if you have a good childcare system, as well as dealing with sort of gender-related issues as well. And more generally, I guess, the in-work benefit system seems to be an area of expansion, given that, unfortunately, that's a reflection of the failure of the labour market in some respects. But universal credit, until recently, had quite a generous work allowance, which was kind of a universal, non-withdrawable component of universal credit. And it strikes me that that was only removed for quite sort of cynical, cost-saving reasons, when actually there's a good reason to expand those kind of provisions to help facilitate transitions into the labour market.
Thanks, Rana.
Okay. Thank you, Nick. Yeah, I did make a mental note for myself to say something positive, and I forgot because there was just too much negative. But I did have the universal child benefit in here, and as Fran had mentioned, yeah, I mean, a lot, certainly from the perspective of lower middle income countries, they are in those circles, yeah, where this kind of program is being sort of celebrated as something that can be done, that they can take on, and certainly it could be. It doesn't need, it is not as politically sensitive as other kinds of reforms, yeah, because if you're talking about universal child benefit, then it is possible to think about that. So the extent of the uptake remains to be seen, of course, but that's something to bear in mind. That's the first thing I would say. In terms of being sort of methodical and sort of thinking positively, at the level of state institutions, the major changes that are happening are in terms of sort of basic housekeeping of social assistance programs, yeah? So the reform of sort of to avoid duplication, to look at eligibility criteria, but a really interesting one is to set up, and this is basic, yeah, a basic registry of beneficiaries and to have that data of who is eligible, what are the poor households, and I think that any researcher would welcome these kinds of systems in order just to be able to know what population to target, though then you could say, this is exactly the reason why targeting is so expensive, yeah, and universalism would be a lot better. So the purpose of these registries clearly needs to be made more transparent, but at least that there is some development there in countries just doing that internal housekeeping, the motive of that being to reduce budget deficits. There you could say there is reason for celebration in the non-state sector. There's a very active civil society sector across these regions, yeah, not just MENA region, which is not just religious in identity, yeah, and a lot of them mobilize, they do a lot of advocacy work, and that hasn't stopped, and I think that will continue, and that's something that should be supported, and is something to be positive about. I also think there's an overlooked area in terms of thinking about the future of welfare, which is the research base. And maybe I would say this, and I interact with a lot of academics in the MENA region. There is a lot of interest now, increasing interest in questions of redistribution and distributive politics and questions of social protection. There's a lot of PhDs in the UK that's being done on this. So I think that supporting research, supporting social science research and developing the capacity of higher education and researchers there in doing this kind of research is positive, because then they know how to ask the important questions, but in a safe way. Having said this, I think the reality is that a lot of Arab countries, to be very specific, are facing inflation. They're facing high public deficits. They continue to have a pattern of jobless growth. Migration continues to be the aspiration of a lot of the educated middle classes. Yeah. So, and I see a lot of political deterioration in a lot of these countries. You could argue that perhaps Tunisia was able to strike a sort of a positive deal after their sort of uprisings, and you could say, well, at least the reform of social assistance, if that reaches people better and provides a better level of benefit, then fair enough. But I think the experience and the research coming out of countries like Egypt at the moment shows that just the administrative capacity to deliver basic cash transfers or food subsidies alone is still quite chaotic and difficult to manage. Then it sort of still leaves a question mark.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for one more question, if people have got before tea. Yes, please. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Colin Downey, a retired paediatrician. You've talked a little bit about parenting and childhood as an emphasis, and you've talked about the self-funding of social care, possibly more in relationship to older populations. So the health service spends a great deal of money on elder populations, and there's an absolute opposition to self-funding. How do you think healthcare and welfare budgets might merge in the future?
The relationship between health and welfare budgets. Rana, do you want to start on this?
Health and welfare budgets.
Yeah.
Okay, well, right, yeah, and that you could say that's another positive one. So the immediate one that comes to my mind is the case of the Lebanon, which I have, the data's there, and there was too much to show. Lebanon is a failed state, and there is a major dependence on the private sector for the delivery of education and health. And Lebanon actually spends one of the largest budgets as a proportion of its GDP on health, because there's a lot of contracting out to private hospitals. So I think that there, for me anyway, there is a major contradiction in terms of some of these countries, how they spend. But again, perhaps the MENA region is not representative, but certainly there is a state healthcare sector. And you can see there is research on Egypt that shows that public sector workers will benefit from the better state hospitals than the population living in poorer areas or more marginalized areas. And I think this is perhaps one of the ironies certainly of this region, which is not poor, relatively speaking, that there's a lot of spending perhaps, and that this goes back to perhaps questions of governance or mismanagement. And I've not referred to the Arab Gulf countries. Yeah, you could argue again that if anything, the welfare has been a bit of a curse there. And if anything, the question now is how to deal with unemployment of the national population, and that perhaps there is too much welfare dependency. But equally, these are countries that are hugely dependent on oil, as we know, and are working hard to find alternative economic sources. Housing, I would say, is the big question. Yeah, and I think that if welfare systems were able to really work on the question of affordable housing, that would go a long way. And of course, out-of-pocket spending on health is very big in this region. So,
Luke, did you want to? Fran.
Just quickly. So you raised two issues. One was about children and one was about older people. And I think you meant, I wasn't quite sure what you meant, but opposition to self-funding, meaning paying for social care?
No, paying for social care will probably come in, but paying for healthcare is opposed. So how are you going to merge
have the two?
Elderly social care and elderly healthcare?
Well, I think there should be opposition to self-funding for either healthcare or social care. So I believe that one of the principles of the welfare state is you shouldn't let the costs lie where they fall. So my father died immediately of a heart attack. My mother died of terminal pancreatic cancer within 2 months. It is absolutely unfair that I didn't have social care costs and other people did. It is absolutely unfair that those other people had social care costs and I don't, and vice versa. So, I mean, I cannot see why we cannot share the cost of social care as we do share the costs of healthcare. And I would not want to be going in the opposite direction. And I think a hypothecated social insurance system seems to work in some other countries. I mean, you know, if for healthcare we have a non-hypothecated general taxation system. I mean, in a sense, I don't really mind which it is, but I think we should be sharing the costs of social care. And I think if people have properties that we think they should be drawing on when they have social care costs, I don't see why they shouldn't be drawing on them when they don't have social care costs. I cannot see the logic for allowing people to pay for their own social care. I really can't. And so I am hoping that that consensus will actually increase. I think it's getting there, but I think it could increase even more. So that's the first one. And I certainly wouldn't want to go down the road of paying for healthcare. The second one was the other way round in a way, and it relates to children, which is that I don't know how many other people read the report by the Gateshead medical personnel who were actually talking about the impact of cuts and poverty on child health. So, in other words, if you don't have an adequate, generous social security system and so on, I mean, including adequately paid jobs, then you are actually creating additional costs for the health system. They were talking about the illness and actually deaths that were likely to be caused by increasing child poverty, as I remember the report. And so it works the other way around, if you like. So we are creating additional healthcare costs, I'm convinced, by the levels to which we are allowing child poverty to increase, because that was the way in which we decided to deal with austerity by and large. It was families with children who have borne the cost of that far more than other groups in the population. And so the other way round works as well. We are creating additional health costs by not having an adequate and generous welfare system in other ways.
Thank you. I can see various people twitching to ask questions, but I fear we ought to stop and have tea. And actually, I think it's a good moment to stop, because those last comments were about the moral basis for thinking about social welfare systems. And I think that is important as well, that we should be thinking about those sorts of justifications, that politics, the technology and so on, all very important, but there is a moral case about what sort of society we want to live in. So let's leave it there and go and have a cup of tea. Thanks very much to the lovely panellists.